World War I is usually remembered through maps, casualty numbers, and the names of famous battles, the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, but those names don't explain what it was actually like to be there, trapped in the mud, the gas, the shell fire, and the waiting. They don't tell you what it felt like to watch friends die beside you or to survive something you could never really escape. In this video, we're going to follow a series of real frontline stories from across the war. The mud along the Chemin des Dames held secrets that would never surface. In the early hours of April 16th, 1917, beneath a sky still dark and heavy with coming rain, thousands of men from the French colonial regiments and line divisions prepared to advance into what their commanders promised would be the decisive blow against the German lines. Among them stood Corporal Henri Baudin of the 1st Régiment Étranger, formerly a stoneworker from Lyon who had enlisted in the Foreign Legion in August 1914. His hands, which once shaped cathedral repairs, now gripped a Liebel rifle with bayonet fixed. The regiment had been pulled from reserve positions near Soissons 3 days prior, marched through villages whose names they didn't bother learning anymore, and fed into assembly trenches that smelled of quicklime and last week's dead. Baudin's section occupied a forward sap barely deep enough to stand upright. Water filled the duckboards to ankle depth despite the drainage efforts. The men had received their brandy ration at 0400 hours, the traditional French courage before an assault, though most had long since stopped believing alcohol made bullets miss. Around him, legionnaires from a dozen nations checked their kit in silence. There were Russians who couldn't return home, Italians who'd crossed the Alps seeking adventure, a few Germans who'd fled military service in their own country only to find themselves fighting their former countrymen. Nobody spoke much anymore. The Nivelle offensive, as the staff officers called it, had been explained to them in terms of breakthrough and victory. The veterans among them knew better. At 0600 hours, the French artillery began its preparatory bombardment. The sound transcended hearing and became a physical force that compressed the chest and made thought impossible. Baudin had experienced artillery before countless times, but the sheer concentration along this sector surpassed anything from Verdun or the Somme. French 75mm guns, 155mm howitzers, and heavy railway artillery transformed the German positions ahead into a landscape of smoke and flame. The barrage was supposed to last for days, pulverizing the defenses, cutting the wire, destroying the machine gun nests. But Nivelle's staff had shortened the preliminary bombardment, believing surprise would compensate for thoroughness. This decision would cost thousands of lives. When the assault began at dawn, Baudin's section climbed from their trench and moved forward through a landscape that no longer resembled France. Shell craters overlapped shell craters. Trees existed only as blackened stumps. The ground itself had been churned and rechurned until the limestone bedrock showed through in places. The promised creeping barrage moved ahead of them, but the German positions, built into caves and tunnels carved from the limestone cliffs, had survived largely intact. As the French waves advanced up the slope toward the Chemin des Dames ridge, machine gun fire erupted from positions that weren't supposed to exist anymore. Baudin wrote in his Carnet de Guerre that night, one of the few entries that survived the war, "We went forward believing in our generals. The Boches were waiting in their holes like rats, untouched. Our comrades fell in rows, cut down before they could even see the enemy." I watched Legionnaire Kovac take a bullet through the throat. He was trying to help another man who'd stepped on wire. Both died there. We made it to their first trench but could go no further. The limestone gave them fortresses, we had only flesh. The Nivelle offensive collapsed within days. The French army had suffered over 120,000 casualties in the first week alone. Mutinies would follow shortly after, spreading through dozens of divisions as men simply refused to participate in any more massed assaults. But that came later. In those April days, men like Baudin continued advancing because orders demanded it and because stopping meant dying in place. The Legion lost nearly half its effective strength in the first 3 days. Baudin survived, though 16 men from his original section of 30 did not. He would spend the remainder of 1917 in hospitals recovering from shrapnel wounds and what the doctors called neurasthenia, but what everyone else understood as the accumulated weight of too much death witnessed too closely. Across the lines and back in time, in a sector far to the north, Gefreiter Klaus Richter of Infantry Regiment 119 had learned different lessons about survival. The autumn of 1916 found his regiment dug into defensive positions north of Bapaume, along the northern sectors of the Somme battlefield. The regiment belonged to the 26th Reserve Division, and by October they had endured 4 months of the most intensive bombardment in human history. Richter had been a school teacher in Saxony before the war, a man who valued order and precision. The trenches taught him that order was an illusion, and precision meant nothing when artillery shells fell at random. The German defensive system along the Somme had been constructed with characteristic thoroughness. Deep dugouts, some reaching 30 feet underground, with multiple entrances and reinforced timber supports. Communication trenches connected the front line to support and reserve positions. Machine gun posts were sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. Barbed wire stretched in belts sometimes 50 yards deep. Yet despite all this preparation, the British bombardment that preceded their July 1st assault had been so overwhelming that sections of the front line had simply ceased to exist, buried under tons of earth and steel. Richter's company had been in reserve when the British attacked on July 1st. They'd been rushed forward as the scale of the assault became clear. What he found in the forward positions had permanently altered his understanding of war's nature. German casualties from the preliminary bombardment had been severe, with entire dugouts collapsed, burying their occupants alive. But the British had suffered far worse. The attackers had come forward in waves, walking upright across no man's land, and German machine gunners who'd survived in their deep positions had emerged to fire into masses of men who couldn't take cover on ground stripped of all vegetation. Richter had helped count British bodies in front of one position. They stopped counting at 300. But that was July. By October, the nature of the battle had changed. The British had learned. They came in smaller groups now, using shell holes for cover, attacking at night, bringing tanks that could cross trenches and crush wire. The constant bombardment never stopped. Richter's company spent 7 days in the front line, then 7 in support, then 7 in reserve, then back to the front in an endless rotation. Men who survived physically often broke mentally. The regimental diary recorded increasing cases of what they called granite shock, shell shock, though the high command insisted it was cowardice or malingering. In late October, during one of those periods in the front line, Richter experienced what he later called his worst day of the war. A British attack had been expected at dawn, but instead it came during the night, preceded by a box barrage that sealed off their section of trench. The attackers were from a Northumberland battalion, experienced troops who knew their work. They brought grenades, bayonets, and a determination born of their own losses. The fight lasted hours in darkness, broken only by flares and the flash of explosions. Richter killed a British soldier with his spade in a traverse where both their rifles had jammed with mud. The man had been perhaps 20 years old. Afterward, Richter sat in the trench beside the body for an hour, unable to move until his Unteroffizier pulled him away. His diary entry from that period survived, written in cramped script on pages stained with mud. We are told we defend the fatherland. I no longer know what we defend, perhaps just ourselves and the men beside us. The earth here has drunk so much blood it should be red, but it is only grey. Everything is grey. The sky, the mud, the faces of the living and the dead. I think sometimes I have died already, and this is some punishment I don't remember earning. Infantry Regiment 119 would remain on the Somme until the battle's end in November, by which time its effective strength had been reduced by over 60%. Richter survived, promoted to Unteroffizier, though he would carry the tremor in his hands for the rest of his life. The regiment was pulled back to Flanders for rest and refitting. There would be no rest. Flanders meant Ypres, and Ypres meant gas and mud, and a different form of hell. On the other side of no man's land, in that same October period, Private Thomas Ashworth of the 7th Battalion, King's Own Lancaster Regiment, 56th Brigade, 19th Division, was learning what veterans already knew, that hope was a luxury the Western Front couldn't sustain. His battalion had been sent to the Somme as part of the reinforcements feeding the dying offensive. Most of the original volunteers from 1914 were gone now, either dead, wounded, or transferred. Replacements like Ashworth, conscripted in early 1916, filled the ranks with men who had no illusions about adventure or glory. The 7th Battalion had been assigned to take a German strongpoint near Les Sars in mid-October. The position consisted of a fortified farm complex with concrete pillboxes and deep dugouts, connected to the German line by communication trenches. British artillery had been pounding it for 3 days. Intelligence assured them the position was untenable. Intelligence was wrong, as intelligence usually was. The attack was set for dawn on October 23rd, following a brief but intense bombardment. Ashworth's platoon assembled in a jumping-off trench that had been a German position 2 weeks earlier. The bodies of previous German occupants hadn't all been removed. They lay in recesses, partially buried, or simply incorporated into the trench wall, where burial was impossible. The smell never left the clothes or skin. The men had stopped mentioning it. At 0600 hours, British artillery resumed its bombardment, walking forward in a creeping barrage that the infantry was supposed to follow at a distance of 50 yards. Theory and practice rarely aligned. The barrage lifted too quickly, or the advance moved too slowly, or both. Ashworth's platoon emerged from their trench into the grey morning light and started forward through a landscape of mud and shell holes. The German machine guns opened fire immediately, the distinctive sound cutting through the morning air. Men fell. Others sought what cover they could find in shell craters, already half filled with water. The attack faltered within 200 yards of its start line. Officers blew whistles for renewed advance. Some men responded, others remained in their holes, and who could blame them? Ashworth made it to within 50 yards of the German wire before a shell burst nearby, the concussion throwing him into a crater. He landed half in water, his rifle lost, his hearing gone to a high-pitched whine. And 2 other soldiers from his battalion were already in the crater. One was wounded, holding his stomach and making sounds that weren't quite words. The other was dead, though it took Ashworth several minutes to realize this, as the dead man sat upright, held in place by the mud. They remained in that crater for 14 hours until darkness allowed withdrawal. The dead man's name had been Private William Fletcher. They'd trained together at the depot in Lancashire. Fletcher had worked in a cotton mill before the war and talked constantly about the girl he planned to marry when he returned. The wounded man died before noon, drowning when he lost consciousness and his face settled into the water. Ashworth couldn't move him because any movement above the crater's rim drew fire. He wrote no diary entry about that day. He wrote nothing at all anymore. The battalion war diary recorded the attack as unsuccessful and noted 23 killed, 57 wounded, and 12 missing. Ashworth survived physically intact, though he never slept well again and flinched at loud sounds for the remaining 60 years of his life. The 7th Battalion remained on the Somme until the offensive's end, then rotated to other sectors. They would participate in 3rd Ypres the following year, where Ashworth would earn a military medal for carrying wounded men through a gas attack. He never spoke about the war after demobilization, not even to his wife, and when he died in 1976, his children found among his belongings a single photograph of men in uniform, their names unknown even to him by then, faces from a time he'd spent half a century trying to forget. Further north, in the Ypres salient, Canadian forces were learning their own harsh lessons. By 1917, the Canadian Corps had established a reputation as elite shock troops, but this reputation had been purchased with blood. Corporal James McLeod of the 2nd Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, 1st Canadian Division, had been present for that education. A fisherman from Nova Scotia before enlistment, McLeod had survived the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, where the Germans first used chlorine gas against Canadian positions. He'd fought at the Somme in 1916. By the time his battalion moved into positions for the assault on Passchendaele in October 1917, he'd been wounded twice and had watched his original platoon replaced 3 times over. The Passchendaele Offensive, officially the Third Battle of Ypres, had begun in July, with British forces attempting to break out of the Ypres salient and capture the Belgian coast. By October, the offensive had devolved into a nightmare of mud and minimal gains measured in hundreds of yards. The autumn rains had turned the battlefield into a swamp. The intensive bombardment had destroyed the drainage systems built over centuries by Flemish farmers. Water filled every shell hole. Men and horses drowned in mud. Wounded men who couldn't move sank and suffocated. The mud wasn't like normal mud. It was liquid clay mixed with raw sewage, decomposing bodies, and chemical residue from gas shells. It clung to everything and dried to concrete-like hardness. The Canadian Corps received orders to take Passchendaele village, sitting on a low ridge that represented high ground in this drowned landscape. The assault began on October 26th, with the 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions leading. MacLeod's 1st Division was in reserve but moved forward within days as casualties mounted. The Germans held the high ground and had constructed concrete pillboxes that resisted everything except direct hits from heavy artillery. Their machine gun teams had clear fields of fire across the mudflats. They had also sighted their artillery carefully with pre-registered coordinates for every approach route. MacLeod's battalion went forward on October 30th to support the second phase of the attack. The approach march took hours, moving in single file along duckboard tracks that were the only solid paths through the mud. Men who stepped off the duckboards often sank to their knees or deeper. Some sections of track had been destroyed by shell fire, requiring detours through knee-deep mire. German artillery fired harassment barrages throughout the night. Shells fell seemingly at random, throwing up great gouts of mud and water. The explosions were different here than on solid ground. The mud absorbed some of the shrapnel but amplified the concussion. Men's lungs hemorrhaged from the pressure waves. The battalion reached its jumping-off position in a captured section of the German line just before dawn. The position consisted of linked shell holes rather than a proper trench. Everything was mud. MacLeod's section had been ordered to advance across 500 yards of open ground, take a pillbox complex marked on the map as Crest Farm, and consolidate the position. The preliminary bombardment started at 0540 hours. MacLeod watched the shells fall on the ridge ahead, the explosions creating more mud, solving nothing. At 0600 hours, whistles blew, and the Canadians went forward. The advance happened in slow motion. Men couldn't walk normally through mud that gripped their legs with each step. They struggled forward, exhausted before contact with the enemy. German machine gun fire began almost immediately. MacLeod saw men hit by bullets simply fall forward into the mud and disappear. Others tried to take cover in shell holes already full of water and chemical sludge. The lucky ones were killed instantly. The wounded drowned or died slowly from their injuries in water, too contaminated for survival even without wounds. MacLeod's section made it to within 100 yards of Crest Farm before they could advance no further. The pillbox was intact, its machine gun firing methodically into the advancing Canadians. They'd lost half their strength. The survivors found what cover they could and remained there, unable to move forward or back until darkness. MacLeod spent the day in a shell hole with 3 other men. One was wounded, gut-shot, and his screaming eventually stopped around noon. Another died from blood loss from wounds to both legs, his tourniquet having failed. By nightfall, only MacLeod and Private David Wilson remained alive in that hole. Wilson was 19 years old from Montreal and had been in France for 6 weeks. He couldn't stop shaking despite the relatively mild temperature. MacLeod held him partly to keep him warm and partly to keep him quiet because German patrols were out listening for wounded men. They stayed that way for hours. Wilson died sometime before dawn, not from wounds but from shock and exhaustion. MacLeod made it back to Canadian lines the next night, one of 8 men from his 32-man section to return. The battalion had suffered 40% casualties in a single day for a gain of less than 300 yards. He wrote later, in a letter that his sister preserved, "They told us Passchendaele was important, that taking it would mean something. I don't know what it meant. I know we lost good men in mud that took them as surely as bullets. I know that David Wilson from Montreal died in my arms from nothing I could name except the weight of all of it, the whole business, a boy from Montreal who should be alive." The Canadian Corps would eventually take Passchendaele village in November at a cost of over 15,000 casualties for a tactical objective of debatable value. The village itself was ruins, and the spring of 1918 would see the Germans recapture all the gained ground in a matter of days during their spring offensive. MacLeod survived the war and returned to Nova Scotia, where he resumed fishing. He spoke rarely of his service and died in 1951 from lung damage attributed to gas exposure decades earlier. By 1918, the Americans had arrived in force, bringing fresh troops to a war of exhaustion. The American Expeditionary Force faced a steep learning curve, and that learning was paid for with the lives of men who trusted their training would suffice. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 26th Yankee Division, 102nd Infantry Regiment, came from Massachusetts Mill Country. He'd enlisted in the National Guard years before the war for the extra pay and the camaraderie. When the division deployed to France in late 1917, he was among the few with any military experience at all. Most of the men in his platoon had been civilians 6 months earlier. The 26th Division spent the spring of 1918 in quiet sectors, learning trench routine under French supervision. But by July, German forces had launched a major offensive along the Marne, and American divisions were committed to combat in earnest. The 102nd Infantry moved into positions near Château-Thierry, part of the Allied line holding against the German advance. The landscape here differed from the Somme or Flanders. There were still trees, though damaged. Villages existed as ruins rather than mere names on maps. The front line zigzagged through fields and forests, less static than in the north, more fluid, and therefore more dangerous in different ways. O'Brien's company took over a section of line in early July, occupying trenches recently evacuated by French units. The positions were adequate but showed signs of hasty construction. Dugouts were shallow, wire was sparse. The French soldiers who guided them into position offered advice that the Americans only partially understood. Language barriers complicated everything. More significantly, the Americans lacked the hard-won institutional knowledge that came from years of fighting. They didn't know which sounds mattered and which didn't. They didn't understand the patterns of enemy artillery. They hadn't yet learned to read the landscape for danger signs. On the night of July 14th, German raiding parties hit multiple points along the American line. These weren't large-scale attacks, but rather infiltration tactics designed to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, and test the new enemy's resolve. O'Brien's section was hit around 0200 hours. The Germans came quietly, having cut through the wire earlier. They threw grenades into the trench and followed with rifle fire. The Americans responded with courage, but not coordination. Men fired at shadows, others struggled with their rifles, the mechanisms unfamiliar in darkness and stress. The fight lasted perhaps 15 minutes before the Germans withdrew, taking 2 American prisoners with them. The casualties were modest, 3 killed and 5 wounded from O'Brien's platoon. But the psychological impact was severe. These men had trained for combat in abstract terms. The reality of German soldiers appearing in their trench at night, throwing explosives at close range, bayoneting anyone within reach, then disappearing into darkness, shattered assumptions about war's nature. O'Brien himself killed a German soldier that night, shooting him at perhaps 10 feet distance. The man fell backward over the trench parapet. O'Brien never learned his name or unit, never knew anything about him except that he'd been trying to kill Americans and had failed. The 26th Division would remain in combat through the summer and into the fall, participating in the reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient and then the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive. O'Brien survived both, though he was wounded during the September fighting when shrapnel from an artillery shell caught him in the left shoulder and back. He recovered in a field hospital and returned to his unit in October. By then, the division had learned. The Green Troops of July had become veterans who understood trench raiding, artillery patterns, and the 1,000 small skills that meant survival. This knowledge had cost the 26th Division over 1,400 dead and nearly 10,000 wounded by war's end. In late September 1918, as American forces pushed into the Meuse-Argonne, O'Brien's reduced platoon participated in the attack on German positions in the Argonne forest. The forest had been fortified for 4 years. German defensive lines ran through dense woods broken by ravines and steep hillsides. Machine gun nests were sited to cover every approach. Artillery was pre-registered on all likely assembly areas. The American attack began on September 26th with overwhelming force but limited coordination. Units became separated in the forest, communications broke down, small groups of Americans fought isolated actions against German positions they stumbled upon by accident. O'Brien's platoon, now down to 22 men from its original 40, advanced through the forest following a compass bearing and a sketched map that proved inaccurate. They encountered a German machine gun position in a ravine, well concealed and protected by wire and log fortifications. The position controlled a trail that the Americans needed to cross. O'Brien organized an assault, leading half the platoon in a flanking movement, while the other half provided covering fire. The attack succeeded, though 5 Americans were killed, including both of the platoon's other sergeants. The German gun crew, 4 men, died at their weapon. After the position was taken, O'Brien found a letter on one of the dead Germans. It was written in German, which he couldn't read, but the tone seemed clear from the way it was folded and kept close to the body. He placed it back where he'd found it. There was no hatred in this. By late 1918, most combat soldiers on both sides had moved past hatred into something more like resignation. They killed because that was the task, and they died because that was the risk. The German soldiers in that machine gun nest had probably understood this as clearly as the Americans who killed them. O'Brien wrote to his brother, a letter his family kept. "We are told we fight for democracy and freedom. I believe this is true in some large sense I can't quite grasp from inside a forest where men die for a trail crossing. What I know is that I fight for the men beside me, and they fight for me, and we all hope to live until this ends. The Germans we kill are not monsters. They are men like us, far from home, doing what they are told. I think this is the truth of it, though no one says it plainly." The 26th Division would remain in combat until the armistice on November 11th. O'Brien survived and returned to Massachusetts, where he worked in a shoe factory and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke of the war, but maintained correspondence with several men from his platoon until old age. He died in 1959, and among his effects was a small leather notebook containing names of men from his unit who died in France. He'd written them down shortly after the war, and apparently reviewed the list periodically, as evidenced by wear patterns on the pages. The notebook contained 73 names. In the final year of the war, as American forces grew stronger and German forces weakened, the nature of combat shifted, but its fundamental brutality remained constant. Private First Class Ernst Vogel of the Infantry Regiment 86, part of the 10th Landwehr Division, experienced the war's final phase from positions that grew increasingly desperate. Vogel had been conscripted in 1917 at age 18, trained for 3 months, and sent to the Western Front as part of the replacement drafts that kept German units nominally at strength despite catastrophic losses. By the summer of 1918, Vogel's regiment held positions in the Champagne sector, facing French forces that included American units growing more competent with each engagement. The German spring offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. The Allies now held the initiative. German troops were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that defeat was approaching. Food rations had been reduced multiple times. Horses were dying from malnutrition, which meant artillery couldn't be moved effectively. Reinforcements arrived younger and less trained with each draft. The influenza epidemic that would kill millions worldwide was already ravaging the armies, with men dying in trenches from disease as readily as from enemy fire. Vogel's company occupied a defensive position northwest of Reims, part of a line that had held for 3 years but was now showing signs of collapse. The trenches were maintained poorly by comparison to earlier years. There weren't enough men to properly garrison the positions. Officers who would have been considered too junior for command in 1914 now led battalions. The veterans who'd survived 4 years of fighting carried a particular weight in their eyes that the new conscripts found disturbing. These men had lost all illusions and fought on only from discipline, habit, and the knowledge that surrender might mean years in prison camps, where conditions were often lethal. On July 15, 1918, the Germans launched their final offensive of the war, the Second Battle of the Marne. Vogel's regiment participated in the initial assault, attacking across ground they'd defended for months. The attack followed the pattern of previous offensives: brief but intensive artillery preparation, then infantry assault using infiltration tactics developed over years of combat. but the Allies had learned to defend in depth, absorbing the initial assault and counterattacking with fresh reserves, particularly American units who brought numbers the Germans couldn't match. The German attack made initial gains but stalled within 2 days. Allied counterattacks began on July 18th. Vogel's regiment, having advanced perhaps 2 miles in the offensive's opening, now found itself defending hastily prepared positions against French and American attacks supported by tanks and artillery concentrations that dwarfed anything the Germans could provide. The retreat began in stages, always intending to stabilize on the next ridge, the next river, the next forest line, but stability never came. The German army in France was dying on its feet. Vogel experienced combat during this period as a series of confused withdrawals, interrupted by desperate defensive stands. His company would occupy a position for hours or days, repel attacks, then receive orders to fall back because adjacent units had already retreated, leaving them exposed. They carried what supplies they could. Everything else was abandoned. The wounded who couldn't walk were sometimes left for Allied medical personnel, sometimes shot by their own officers to prevent capture and interrogation. Vogel watched his company commander, a captain who'd earned the Iron Cross First Class at Verdun, execute 2 badly wounded men rather than leave them. The captain wept while doing this. No one spoke of it afterward. In late July, during another withdrawal, Vogel's section was caught by French artillery while crossing open ground. The barrage came without warning, as the Germans no longer had the reconnaissance assets to provide adequate intelligence on enemy artillery positions. Shells landed among the moving troops, men simply disappeared in the explosions, others fell wounded and were left because stopping meant dying. Vogel felt shrapnel hit his back and leg but remained upright and continued moving. The wounds weren't severe enough to stop him, and stopping meant being left behind. He made it to the designated rally point, a shattered village where perhaps 40 men from the company assembled. The company had started the day with over 100. A captured letter from Vogel, found by French forces in an abandoned German position, recorded his state of mind. "We know the war is lost. The Americans come in endless waves. Our food is spoiled grain and horse meat. The officers tell us we defend Germany, but we all know we defend nothing anymore. We retreat and retreat. Men die for a village we will abandon tomorrow. I think often of home, of my mother and sisters, and wonder if I will see them again. I think probably I will not. We are the lost generation, whether we live or die." Vogel didn't survive to see the armistice. He was killed on September 28, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive when American artillery hit the dugout where his section sheltered. The dugout's entrance collapsed, burying everyone inside. German records list him as killed in action, though his body was never recovered. He was 19 years old. His family received notification of his death in December 1918, 1 month after the war ended. They never learned the specific circumstances, only that he had died in France. The final months of 1918 saw combat intensity that matched anything from earlier years, despite the war's outcome being clear. Men continued dying for ground that would be abandoned, for causes that had long since lost their meaning to the soldiers doing the fighting. The casualty lists from October and November 1918 record names of men who survived 4 years of war only to die in its final weeks. There is a particular cruelty in this, though war's essential nature is always cruel, regardless of timing. Private Thomas Becker of the 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division, American Expeditionary Force, was one such man. He'd arrived in France in June 1918, fought through the summer offensives, and participated in the Meuse-Argonne campaign that began in late September. The 1st Division, known as the Big Red One, had established itself as one of the AEF's most reliable units. But reliability meant being committed to the hardest fighting, and the hardest fighting meant casualties. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest American battle of the war, involving over 1 million American troops attacking through terrain that favored defense. The Argonne forest and the heights above the Meuse River provided German forces with ideal defensive positions. The German army, though collapsing on other fronts, fought with desperate skill in this sector. American casualties mounted accordingly. The 1st Division attacked toward the town of Sedan, fighting through successive German defensive lines, taking villages whose names the Americans couldn't pronounce, advancing across ground measured in yards per day. Becker's platoon participated in an attack on November 1st, 1918, against German positions near the village of Buzensee. The attack followed the now standard pattern: artillery preparation, then infantry assault, supported by tanks. But patterns didn't reduce danger. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Artillery fell on pre-registered coordinates. The fighting degenerated into small unit actions, squads and platoons fighting isolated battles across broken terrain. Becker was hit by machine gun fire while crossing a field northeast of the village. The bullet entered his abdomen, a wound that meant slow death without immediate surgery. His squad carried him to a shell hole and attempted first aid, but the damage was beyond their capability to address. A medic reached them after perhaps 20 minutes and confirmed what everyone already knew: morphine was administered. Becker remained conscious but in diminishing pain as the drug took effect. He died approximately 2 hours after being wounded, surrounded by men from his squad who'd known him for 5 months. He had no time to write letters or final words. His personal effects included a photograph of a young woman, probably his girlfriend or wife, and a pocket Bible with family names written on the flyleaf. These were sent to his family in Ohio, along with notification of his death. He was 23 years old. His death occurred 10 days before the armistice. The ground he died taking was never strategically important. The 1st Division would take Sedan, but Sedan's capture changed nothing about the war's outcome, which had already been determined by Germany's broader collapse. The mathematics of the war's final months demonstrate its senseless persistence. Approximately 350,000 men were killed in combat between July and November 1918, dying for a result already certain. Each of these deaths represented an individual tragedy, a family destroyed, a future erased. The names fill memorial walls and cemetery registries. Most are forgotten now, except by descendants who maintain memory of men they never knew. The war consumed a generation and left the survivors scarred in ways that often didn't become apparent until decades later. The nature of wounds from the Great War extended beyond the physical. Shell shock, though recognized by medical staff, remained poorly understood and often treated as cowardice or malingering. Men who'd functioned adequately for years sometimes broke suddenly, rendered unable to continue by no specific event, but rather by the cumulative weight of sustained horror. Others maintained functionality during the war, but collapsed afterward when the structure of military discipline no longer held them together. The hospitals of the 1920s contained thousands of men whose wounds were invisible but debilitating. Captain Jonathan Reed of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, 19th Brigade, 33rd Division, survived the war physically intact but carried injuries that shaped his remaining decades. Reed had been commissioned in 1915, served on the Somme at Arras through 3rd Ypres and into the final advances of 1918. He'd been wounded twice, gassed once, and had seen his battalion destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. By November 1918, he was one of the few officers from his original battalion still serving with the unit. Reed's final action of the war occurred on November 10th, one day before the armistice, during the crossing of the Sambre-Oise Canal near Orz. The 2nd Battalion was assigned to force a crossing against German positions on the far bank. The Germans, though aware of the approaching armistice, continued fighting with their usual competence. The canal crossing required boats and improvised bridges under direct fire. Reed led his company across in the early morning darkness, taking casualties from machine gun fire throughout the crossing. They established a foothold on the far bank, drove the Germans from immediate positions, and began consolidating. The poet Wilfred Owen, serving with the 2nd Battalion, was killed that morning during the canal crossing. He'd been shot by a German machine gun while helping to organize defenses on the far bank. Reed had known Owen slightly, had read some of his poetry, and had approved his recommendation for a military cross for actions in October. Owen's death, so close to war's end, seemed to Reed particularly meaningless, though on reflection, all the deaths seemed meaningless by that point. The war ended 24 hours later. The 2nd Battalion had suffered 38 casualties, taking a canal crossing that ceased to matter the next day. Reed returned to England in 1919, was demobilized, and attempted to resume civilian life. He found this impossible. The skills that made him an effective combat officer had no peacetime application. The experiences that had filled 4 years couldn't be discussed with people who hadn't been there. He maintained correspondence with surviving officers from his battalion, but found even these exchanges difficult as they avoided speaking plainly about what they'd experienced. Reed never married, worked intermittently at various jobs, and died in 1946 from pneumonia complicated by old lung damage from gas exposure. His death certificate listed no next of kin. The German army's return home in late 1918 and early 1919 brought its own traumas. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber of Reserve Infantry Regiment 241 marched back to Germany with what remained of his battalion in December 1918. They'd surrendered their weapons at collection points in Belgium, then walked home through a Germany convulsed by revolutionary upheaval. The Kaiser had abdicated, the government was provisional and weak. Communist uprisings challenged state authority in multiple cities. The soldiers who'd fought for 4 years returned to a country that blamed them for losing a war, while simultaneously expecting them to restore order. Weber had been commissioned from the ranks in 1916 after demonstrating leadership during the Verdun battles. He'd led his platoon, then company, through the last 2 years of war, surviving when most of his contemporaries had not. He was 24 years old in November 1918 and had known nothing but military service since age 20. The transition to peace left him adrift. The army that demobilized him provided no support beyond a small payment and civilian clothing. The state he'd served was collapsing. The economy was destroyed. Food was scarce. The influenza epidemic was killing thousands. Weber's family in Bavaria had been notified of his survival, but when he reached home in January 1919, he found his father dead from influenza and his mother barely managing. 2 younger siblings depended on him. There were no jobs for former officers. The skills he'd developed commanding men in combat had no peacetime application. Germany's economy was in collapse, with hyperinflation beginning to destroy what little wealth remained. Weber found occasional work as a labourer, though he was competing with millions of other demobilized soldiers for scarce positions. He wrote in a letter to a former comrade, "We were told we fought for Germany. I believed this once. Now I see Germany has no use for us. We are reminders of defeat, inconvenient men who survived when perhaps it would have been simpler if we had not. I think often of the men who died. They at least are remembered as heroes. We who live are simply unemployed veterans of a lost cause." Weber would eventually find work in the postal service, a job he held until conscripted again in 1939 for the Second World War. He served in France in 1940 as a logistics officer, survived, and returned to postal work after 1945. He died in 1963, having lived through 2 world wars and the complete destruction of the nation he'd served in his youth. His children knew he'd been a soldier, but knew nothing of his specific experiences. The war he'd fought in remained unspoken, a presence acknowledged only by silence. The French experience of war's end carried different burdens. France had won, but at catastrophic cost. Entire regions lay devastated. Over 1.3 million French soldiers had died. Another 4 million had been wounded, many permanently disabled. The victory celebrations in Paris couldn't obscure the reality that France had been bled nearly to death. Villages throughout the country erected monuments to their dead. Lists of names that sometimes included a quarter of the young men who'd enlisted in 1914. Adjutant Henri Moreau of the 151st Régiment d'Infanterie survived the war and returned to his village in Brittany in early 1919. He'd enlisted in August 1914 as part of the general mobilization, fought at the Marne through the battles of 1915, at Verdun in 1916, survived the mutinies of 1917, and endured the final German offensives and Allied advances of 1918. He was 29 years old and had spent nearly 5 years in uniform. His village had sent 76 men to war. 31 had not returned. Their names would be carved on a memorial in the village square, a monument that still stands. Moreau's return brought no particular celebration. The village was consumed with grief for the dead and concern for the wounded. 3 men had returned blinded, gassed, or without limbs. The local economy had collapsed, with all the young men gone. Fields lay untended. Buildings needed repair. The few men who returned found themselves expected to resume normal life, as if 5 years of mechanized slaughter had been merely an interruption. This proved impossible for most. Moreau himself struggled with what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder. He experienced nightmares, violent reactions to sudden sounds, and periods of depression that made work impossible. His family didn't understand this, and the village priest advised prayer and acceptance of God's will. The local doctor had no treatments beyond sedatives. Moreau endured because that was the expectation. He married in 1920, had 4 children, and worked his family's farm until age prevented it. He died in 1966, having lived 48 years after the war's end, but never entirely leaving it behind. The Canadian return carried similar patterns. Corporal James MacLeod, having survived Passchendaele and the war's subsequent battles, returned to Nova Scotia in 1919. His fishing village had changed little physically, but the social fabric had been torn. 12 men from the village had died in France or Flanders. The memorial service held upon the survivors' return mixed relief and grief in proportions that satisfied no one. MacLeod resumed fishing, working boats in waters he'd known since childhood, but the work felt hollow in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd seen too much to find meaning in daily routines that once seemed sufficient. The Halifax harbour reminded him of British Channel ports. Weather patterns that once were simply weather now resembled conditions before attacks. The sound of thunder brought instantaneous physical reactions, ducking for cover before conscious thought could intervene. He drank more than was healthy, a common pattern among veterans. His family learned not to wake him suddenly or approach unexpectedly. The man who'd left in 1915 hadn't returned. Someone else had come back wearing his face. MacLeod's granddaughter, interviewed decades after his death, remembered him as distant and sad, occasionally kind, but often absent even when physically present. He'd told her once that he'd left the best parts of himself in mud somewhere in Belgium, and the man who came home was just what remained. She hadn't understood this as a child. As an adult, researching his service record and reading about Passchendaele, she began to understand but could never fully grasp what he'd experienced. The gulf between those who'd been there and those who hadn't remained unbridgeable. The American return brought its own complications. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 26th Division returned to Massachusetts in 1919, was formally discharged, and attempted to resume civilian life. The transition proved difficult. The discipline and structure of military service had provided framework for dealing with horror. Civilian life offered no equivalent structure. O'Brien found work in a shoe factory, the same factory where he'd worked before the war, but the work felt meaningless after what he'd experienced. His wife noticed changes in him, periods of silence and distance, reactions to stress that seemed disproportionate to their causes. He couldn't explain what he'd experienced in France. The language didn't exist, or if it existed, he didn't have access to it. How could someone who hadn't been there understand what it meant to hold a dying 19-year-old in a shell hole full of contaminated water? How could anyone comprehend the specific quality of fear that came with knowing you'd be ordered forward into machine gun fire, and that stopping meant being shot by your own officers? O'Brien attended veterans' meetings organized by the American Legion, finding some comfort in the company of men who'd shared similar experiences, but even there, certain things remained unspoken. The meetings focused on camaraderie and mutual support, not on detailed discussion of combat experiences. The men drank together, helped each other find work, and maintained a solidarity forged in France, but they didn't speak plainly about what they'd done and seen. That silence would persist for decades. The British experience reflected similar patterns across millions of individual stories. Private Thomas Ashworth of the 7th King's Own Lancaster Regiment returned to Lancashire in 1919, found work in a textile mill, and lived until 1976 without ever speaking of the war to his family. His children grew up knowing their father had been a soldier, but nothing beyond that basic fact. When asked, he'd change the subject or leave the room. His wife learned not to ask. The silence became its own presence in the household, acknowledged by everyone and discussed by no one. Ashworth suffered from what would now be recognized as severe PTSD, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and depression throughout his remaining years. He self-medicated with alcohol, though never to the point of losing employment. He maintained friendships with several men from his battalion, meeting them annually on the anniversary of the Somme offensive's first day. These meetings involved drinking, some shared silence, and occasional acknowledgement of men who died, but even among veterans, detailed discussion of combat experiences remained rare. The assumption seemed to be that everyone present knew, so speaking of it served no purpose beyond reopening wounds. The generation that fought the Great War carried burdens that shaped the remainder of their lives. They raised children in the shadow of their experiences. They voted for politicians who promised peace, having learned war's true cost. When another war came in 1939, many of these men sent their own sons to fight, unable to prevent history's repetition despite understanding its horror. Some, like Friedrich Weber, were conscripted again themselves, fighting a second war in middle age, watching new generations learn lessons they'd hoped would never need learning again. The physical landscape of the Western Front took decades to recover. The area between Ypres and Lens remained so saturated with unexploded ordnance that farming was impossible for years. The Zone Rouge in France, where the worst fighting had occurred, was simply abandoned as too contaminated for human habitation. Forests destroyed by shellfire regrew slowly. Villages were rebuilt, though often not on their original sites due to the cratered ground. The earth itself had been poisoned by chemicals, contaminated by decomposing bodies, and rendered dangerous by millions of unexploded shells that continue to kill people even now, over a century later. The human cost extended beyond those killed or physically wounded. Millions carried psychological injuries that weren't recognized or treated. Families dealt with fathers and husbands who'd returned, changed in fundamental ways. The silence around these injuries meant they were borne privately, without acknowledgement or support. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formalized for decades. The men who suffered from it in the 1920s and 1930s were simply considered damaged or weak, their symptoms seen as character flaws rather than injuries requiring treatment. The Great War's legacy shaped the remainder of the 20th century in ways both obvious and subtle. The political map of Europe was redrawn. Empires collapsed, new nations emerged. The economic devastation contributed directly to the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. The unresolved tensions and humiliations embedded in the peace treaties guaranteed another war. But beyond these large-scale historical forces, the war shaped millions of individual lives in ways that didn't make history books. Men like Klaus Richter, Thomas Ashworth, James MacLeod, Michael O'Brien, Ernst Vogel, Thomas Becker, Jonathan Reed, Friedrich Weber and Henri Moreau lived decades after the war ended, but those decades were coloured by experiences between 1914 and 1918. The war defined them, limited them, and shaped everything that followed. They were not special or unique. They were representatives of millions who endured similar experiences and carried similar burdens. The tactical situations and combat conditions match historical record. What's missing are the individual voices of most men who fought, as most left no diaries, wrote no memoirs, and died without recording their experiences. The historical record preserves statistics and unit histories, but loses individual human stories beneath aggregated casualty figures. Henri Baudin's carnet de guerre, Klaus Richter's diary entries, Thomas Ashworth's silence, James MacLeod's letter, Michael O'Brien's observations, and Friedrich Weber's post-war letters represent attempts to capture voices that were mostly silent. Real soldiers wrote similar things, felt similar emotions, and struggled with similar burdens. The specifics have been constructed, but the underlying reality is accurate. Men suffered and died in conditions of mechanized horror that challenged human capacity for endurance. Those who survived carried that experience forward into decades that followed. The memorial walls throughout Europe carry names by the thousands. Each name represents a life ended, a family destroyed, a future erased. But the walls can't convey the specific circumstances of each death. They can't describe the mud at Passchendaele, the gas at Ypres, the artillery at Verdun, the machine gun fire at the Somme. They mark loss without capturing what was lost. The men who died took their stories with them. The men who survived often couldn't or wouldn't speak of what they'd experienced. The result is a historical record that documents events but loses human detail beneath strategic narratives and casualty statistics. The Western Front consumed men and returned ghosts. It transformed a generation, breaking some entirely and damaging most of the rest. The soldiers who fought there understood that what they'd experienced couldn't be communicated to those who hadn't shared it. The veterans' silence stemmed partly from trauma, but also from the recognition that explanation was futile. How could someone who'd never been in a trench understand what it meant to spend days surrounded by the dead, unable to bury them, the smell becoming normal? How could someone who'd never experienced artillery bombardment understand the specific quality of fear it produced? The gulf between veteran and civilian experience created isolation that persisted for decades. Veterans gathered together because only other veterans understood, but even among themselves, they often didn't speak directly about combat. The shared experience was acknowledged through presence and silence rather than detailed discussion. This pattern shaped veteran culture throughout the 20th century, creating communities of men bound by experiences they couldn't articulate even to each other. The Great War's ending in November 1918 didn't end its effects. The war continued in damaged bodies, in traumatized minds, in economic collapse, in political instability, and in the seeds of future conflict. The men who fought it carried it forward into the remainder of their lives. Their children inherited shadows of traumas they didn't understand. Their grandchildren grew up in a world shaped by a war they knew only through history books and fading photographs of men in uniform, faces serious, eyes distant, already carrying knowledge of what was coming. The stories preserved here represent fragments of a larger horror that consumed a generation and shaped the century that followed. They are specific but also representative. The names are fictional, but the experiences were real, replicated millions of times across nationalities and fronts. The Great War killed approximately 17 million people, wounded another 20 million, and damaged most who participated in ways that often became apparent only years later. These numbers represent individual human tragedies, accumulated to a scale that challenges comprehension. In quiet moments, in veterans' hospitals and nursing homes through the 1960s and 1970s, old men who'd fought in the Great War sometimes spoke of their experiences as death approached. The details they'd suppressed for decades would surface, fragmentary and traumatic, spoken to nurses or caregivers who often didn't understand what they were hearing. These accounts, when preserved, provide glimpses into experiences that had been carried silently for half a century. Most weren't preserved. Most died with the men who carried them. The last verified veteran of the Great War died in 2012, ending direct human connection to that conflict. What remains are documents, photographs, artifacts, and the physical landscape still scarred by the war's passage. The trenches have mostly collapsed or been deliberately filled. The battlefields are peaceful now, marked by cemeteries and memorials, but returned to agricultural use. The villages destroyed in the fighting have been rebuilt. The forests that were shattered have regrown. Nature has reclaimed the landscape, though the ground still yields bullets, shells, and occasionally human remains when fields are ploughed. But the war persists in memory and in its effects on subsequent history. The political map it created lasted into the 21st century. The economic devastation it caused contributed to depression and subsequent war. The military lessons learned shaped future conflicts. The medical advances developed in response to unprecedented casualties influenced modern medicine. The social changes it catalyzed, particularly regarding women's roles and class structures, accelerated broader transformations already underway. Most importantly, the Great War established patterns that would define 20th century warfare: mechanized killing at industrial scale, civilian populations as legitimate targets, total war consuming entire societies, and the breakdown of traditional distinctions between combatant and non-combatant. These patterns, first fully manifested between 1914 and 1918, would be repeated and amplified in subsequent conflicts. The Great War wasn't the last war, as some had hoped, but rather the first modern war, establishing templates that continue to shape armed conflict into the present. The men who fought it understood something that later generations had to relearn, that war's essential nature is horror, that its costs always exceed its benefits, and that those who survive carry injuries that persist long after fighting ends. This knowledge couldn't prevent future wars, but it informed how those wars were fought and how their veterans were treated. The silence of Great War veterans, their struggles with trauma, and their difficulties reintegrating into civilian life provided lessons that influenced how later generations of veterans were supported, though never adequately. But the attempt has value because it preserves memory of what was suffered, honors those who endured it, and serves as warning against repetition. The Great War should have taught humanity the futility of industrial-scale killing. Instead, it taught nations how to do it more efficiently. The men who fought it knew this was wrong, but lacked power to prevent it. In the end, what remains are names on memorials, aging photographs of serious young men, fading letters preserved by families, and the gradual understanding that the Great War represented not just a historical event, but a fundamental break in human experience. Those who fought it understood they'd witnessed something unprecedented in scale and horror. Those who survived carried that knowledge forward, shaped by it, limited by it, unable to escape it. Their stories deserve preservation, not because they're unusual, but because they're representative of millions of similar stories, most now lost, but all contributing to the larger narrative of human cost that was the First World War's essential truth. The forgotten soldiers whose experiences fill these pages stand for all who served, suffered, and survived or died in conditions that challenged human capacity for endurance. Their voices, whether preserved in documents or reconstructed through historical understanding, speak to the fundamental tragedy of that war, that so many died for so little, that such suffering achieved so few worthwhile ends, and that the generation which experienced it carried burdens that shaped the remainder of their lives and cast shadows across the century that followed.